There's a question at the heart of religious experience that most believers never examine directly. When you think about your relationship with God, what's the foundation? Is it love, genuine affection, gratitude and connection? Or is it fear, the terror of punishment, the anxiety about judgment, the dread of eternal consequences? Most people would immediately say, love. But when you look closely at how faith actually operates in their lives, you find something different. Consider the language of traditional religion. You're taught to fear God's wrath, to tremble before divine judgment, to worry constantly about whether you're good enough to avoid damnation. You're told that God is love, but in the same breath, you're warned about the fires of hell awaiting those who disobey. You're encouraged to feel grateful for salvation, but the gratitude is inseparable from terror about what you've been saved from. This isn't love in any recognizable sense. It's a hostage situation dressed up in spiritual language. Think about how this plays out in actual religious practice. People pray not primarily from joy or connection, but from obligation and fear of consequences. They follow religious rules, not because the rules enhance their lives, but because they're terrified of divine punishment. They teach their children about God, not as a source of love, but as a surveillance system, ensuring good behavior. The relationship with the divine becomes fundamentally transactional. Obey and avoid punishment. Disobey and suffer eternally. Now compare this to any healthy relationship between humans. If someone told you they stayed in a relationship because they were terrified of what their partner would do if they left, you'd recognize that as abuse, not love. If someone said they followed their partner's rules out of fear rather than respect, you'd see the problem immediately. If a parent controlled their child through terror of punishment rather than genuine care, we'd call that trauma. Yet when this exact dynamic is replicated in religion, it's called faith. A philosopher in the 19th century noticed this contradiction and couldn't ignore it. He saw that the God presented by traditional Christianity wasn't a being to love, it was a being to fear. And he recognized that this foundation of fear didn't just fail to produce genuine spirituality, it corrupted the entire religious experience. It turned what could be a source of meaning, connection, and transcendence into a mechanism of psychological control and emotional manipulation. He asked a simple question that most believers never dare to ask themselves. If you weren't afraid of hell, would you still believe? If there were no punishment for disbelief, no eternal consequences for disobedience, no surveillance ensuring compliance, would your faith persist? For many people, honest examination reveals that fear is the foundation, not love. And once you see this, you can't unsee it. Because if your spirituality is built on terror, it's not spirituality at all. It's just Stockholm Syndrome with cosmic stakes. This isn't about attacking faith or defending atheism. It's about examining what genuine spirituality might look like if it were freed from the foundation of fear. Because if love and fear can't coexist in human relationships without one being abusive, why would we accept their combination in our relationship with the divine? And what would faith look like if it were truly based on love rather than terror disguised as reverence? Here's the anomaly that should immediately disturb anyone examining traditional faith. Religious texts claim that God is perfect love, yet they describe a deity who commits or commands genocide, eternal torture, and punishment of innocence. The same Bible that says God is love also describes God drowning nearly all of humanity in a flood, commanding the slaughter of entire cities, including children, and establishing a system where finite sins receive infinite punishment. This isn't an interpretation problem, it's a fundamental contradiction. Look at the actual content of what believers are taught. You're told to love God with all your heart, while simultaneously being informed that this God might send you to eternal torment if you fail to believe the right doctrines or follow the right rules. You're taught that God loves you unconditionally, but the condition is clear: obey or suffer. You're told to approach God without fear, yet the entire theological structure is built on fear of divine judgment and eternal consequences. Now, examine the psychological mechanism this creates. When love and fear are mixed in religious teaching, fear always dominates because the stakes are infinite. You might feel affection for God during a beautiful service or a moment of transcendence, but that affection is constantly undermined by awareness that this same God could condemn you eternally. The emotional experience becomes one of constant anxiety rather than secure love. You're trying to love someone you're also terrified of, which isn't love at all. Compare this to how love works in healthy human relationships. Love flourishes in safety. You can't genuinely love someone if you're constantly afraid they'll harm you. A child can't develop secure attachment to a parent who alternates between affection and threats. A partner can't trust someone who claims to love them while holding punishment over their head. Yet religion asks believers to do exactly this, to feel love for a being who explicitly threatens eternal torture for disobedience. The anomaly becomes even clearer when you examine religious conversion. What typically drives someone to faith? Is it an overwhelming experience of divine love that naturally draws them in? Or is it fear? Fear of hell, fear of judgment, fear of meaninglessness, fear of death. Most conversion narratives center on someone being confronted with their sinfulness and the terrifying consequences if they don't repent. This is fear-based manipulation, not love-based connection. Look at how believers talk about their faith when they're being honest. They don't typically say, "I feel such profound love from God that I naturally want to align my life with that love." They say things like, "I know I should pray more, but I don't," or "I feel guilty when I don't follow the rules," or "I'm worried I'm not doing enough to be saved." This is the language of fear and obligation, not love and connection. The relationship is built on duty and anxiety rather than genuine affection. What's particularly revealing is examining what happens when the fear is removed. Studies of people who leave traditional religion often report that once they stopped believing in hell, their sense of spirituality became healthier and more authentic. Without the terror of eternal punishment, they could explore what they actually valued, what genuinely moved them, what felt spiritually real versus what they'd accepted out of fear. The removal of fear didn't destroy their capacity for spirituality. It liberated it. This creates a profound question for anyone who considers themselves religious. Is your faith actually based on love, or is it based on fear that you've learned to call love because you've never known any alternative? Because if you examine the foundation honestly, you might find that what you thought was spiritual devotion is actually just terror management dressed up in religious language, and recognizing that distinction changes everything. Friedrich Nietzsche's relationship with religion was deeply personal and complicated. Born into a devoutly Lutheran family in 1844, his father was a pastor, as were both grandfathers. The family assumed Friedrich would continue this tradition. From earliest childhood, he was immersed in Christian theology, Bible study, and religious practice. But even as a child, he noticed something that troubled him. The God he was taught to love was primarily presented as someone to fear. Young Nietzsche experienced this contradiction viscerally. He was told God loved him, yet he was taught to constantly examine himself for sin, to fear God's judgment, to worry about his eternal destiny. Religious instruction wasn't about cultivating a loving relationship with the divine. It was about learning to fear consequences and police your own thoughts and behaviors. Even at a young age, he recognized this didn't resemble any healthy form of love he'd observed between people. By his teenage years, Nietzsche was experiencing profound doubt. But what troubled him wasn't primarily the question of God's existence. It was the question of God's character. If God existed as Christianity described, was this actually a being worthy of love? Or was traditional faith just elaborate Stockholm syndrome, where believers convinced themselves they loved a being who held them in permanent terror? He wrote in his private notebooks about the psychological violence of being taught to love what you fear. At 24, Nietzsche became a professor of classical philology, studying ancient Greek and Roman texts. This exposed him to pre-Christian concepts of the divine that operated very differently. Ancient Greeks didn't primarily relate to their gods through fear of eternal punishment. They had reverence, certainly, but not the terrorized obedience that characterized Christianity. This gave Nietzsche a reference point, proof that the fear-based model wasn't the only way humans had conceptualized relationship with the divine. What struck him most powerfully was studying how early Christianity spread. It wasn't primarily through messages of divine love. It was through fear of damnation. The most effective tool for conversion was terrifying people about their eternal fate, then offering salvation as the solution. This created a captive audience. People who adopted faith not because they experienced overwhelming love, but because they were frightened into compliance. The foundation was fear, even if it was later disguised as love. Nietzsche's own health struggles added another dimension to his thinking. He experienced chronic pain, severe migraines, and digestive problems that left him bedridden for days. Traditional Christianity would have told him this. Suffering was either punishment for sin or a test of faith from a loving God. But Nietzsche couldn't reconcile how a being of perfect love would either cause such suffering or demand that he interpret it as somehow beneficial. The theological gymnastics required to maintain belief in divine love despite obvious suffering seemed dishonest. He began investigating the psychology of religious belief more systematically. What he found was that most believers didn't actually experience the love they claimed was central to their faith. They experienced obligation, guilt, fear, and occasional moments of relief from that fear which they interpreted as divine love. But this wasn't genuine love. It was the emotional pattern of an abuse victim experiencing momentary respite from abuse and mistaking that respite for affection. Nietzsche traced this pattern through Christian history and theology. He found that the most influential Christian thinkers emphasized fear as the proper response to God. Fear of God was considered the beginning of wisdom. Trembling before divine majesty was treated as appropriate reverence. The constant awareness of your sinfulness and unworthiness was presented as humility. But all of this was psychological abuse dressed in theological language. His investigation led him to a radical conclusion. The God of traditional Christianity wasn't a God of love. It was a God of power using love language to obscure its fundamentally threatening nature. And believers weren't experiencing genuine spirituality. They were experiencing trauma bonding with a cosmic authority figure. True spirituality, if it existed at all, would have to be liberated from this foundation of fear. Otherwise, it would always be corrupted by the terror at its core. The first piece of evidence Nietzsche presents is strikingly simple. Look at how religious texts actually describe God's behavior, not just God's claimed attributes. The Old Testament God commits genocide with the flood, destroys cities, kills children, commands ethnic cleansing, and establishes laws with brutal punishments. The New Testament introduces hell, infinite torture for finite offenses. This isn't the behavior of a loving being by any recognizable standard. It's the behavior of a tyrant who uses love language to justify violent control. Examine specific passages that believers accept without questioning. God hardens Pharaoh's heart, specifically so he can demonstrate his power through plagues that kill innocent Egyptian children. God tests Abraham by commanding him to murder his son, only stopping at the last moment, a test that would constitute psychological torture if done by a human. God allows Satan to destroy Job's family, health, and livelihood as a bet. These aren't metaphors. They're presented as actual divine actions, and believers are expected to call this love. Now look at the concept of hell, which became central to Christian theology. The idea that a being of perfect love would create a system where people suffer eternally for finite mistakes is incoherent. No loving parent would torture their child forever, no matter what the child did. Yet believers accept that God does exactly this and call it justice. This isn't love. It's infinite vindictiveness dressed up in theological justification. What makes this evidence particularly striking is how believers respond when you point out these contradictions. They don't typically say, "You're right, these actions seem unloving, and perhaps I should question the theology." They engage in elaborate justification. God's ways are mysterious. We can't judge divine actions by human standards. These events served a greater purpose we can't understand. But notice what this means. They're defending indefensible actions by appealing to inscrutability. This is exactly how abuse victims defend their abusers. Nietzsche found this pattern repeated throughout Christian teaching. Consider the doctrine of original sin, the idea that humans are fundamentally corrupt from birth, guilty for sins they didn't commit, worthy of damnation by default. This isn't love. It's starting from a position that makes you worthless and then offering salvation as a gift you don't deserve. It creates permanent psychological debt where you can never feel secure in God's love because you're always fundamentally unworthy of it. Look at how prayer is typically practiced. It's not primarily a joyful conversation with a loving presence. It's petition, pleading, begging, the posture of someone powerless before an authority who might or might not grant requests. People pray for protection from the very God they're praying to. They thank God for not punishing them as they deserve. They constantly examine whether they've prayed correctly, believed correctly, obeyed correctly. This isn't how you relate to someone you love. It's how you relate to someone whose anger you fear. The evidence extends to how believers experience doubt. In a loving relationship, you can express doubts and questions without fear. But in religious contexts, doubt is treated as sin, as evidence of weak faith, as potentially damning. You're not allowed to question whether God's actions are actually loving, because questioning itself is dangerous. This creates a psychological prison where you must constantly suppress your legitimate concerns and call that suppression faith. What's most revealing is examining religious trauma, the psychological damage many people experience from religious upbringing. Common symptoms include chronic guilt, shame, fear of punishment, difficulty trusting one's own judgment, and anxiety about divine surveillance. These aren't symptoms you'd expect from a relationship based on love. They're symptoms of psychological abuse, and they're so common among religious believers that there are entire therapeutic practices dedicated to helping people recover from religious trauma. Consider what believers are taught about their own emotions. Natural human desires are reframed as sinful temptations. Normal self-interest becomes selfish pride. Legitimate anger at injustice becomes unrighteous fury. You're taught to distrust your own feelings and experiences, to see them as corrupt, to suppress them in favor of what authority tells you to feel. This systematic invalidation of your interior life isn't love. It's gaslighting on a cosmic scale. Nietzsche digs deeper into the psychology of fear-based faith by examining what it actually does to human consciousness. When your spirituality is founded on fear, you can't develop genuine love because fear and love are psychologically incompatible. Fear creates distance, vigilance, and self-protection. Love creates intimacy, trust, and openness. You can't simultaneously be afraid of someone and genuinely love them. At best, you can
develop what psychologists call trauma bonding, where moments of relief from fear get mistaken for love. This explains a puzzling pattern in religious experience. Believers often report moments of profound peace or joy during worship, which they interpret as feeling God's love. But examine what precedes these moments. Typically, intense fear or guilt that's temporarily relieved. You feel terrible about your sinfulness. Then you're reminded of salvation, and the relief feels like love.
But this isn't love. It's the emotional release that comes from temporary escape from anxiety. It's the same mechanism that makes hostages sometimes bond with captors who occasionally show them kindness. The investigation reveals how fear-based faith distorts moral development. When you act morally out of fear of punishment rather than genuine care for others, you haven't developed real morality. You've just learned to avoid consequences. A child who shares only because they'll be punished if they don't hasn't learned generosity. They've learned fear management. Similarly, a believer who acts ethically only because they fear hell hasn't developed moral character. They've just internalized a threat-based compliance system. This creates a particular kind of spiritual poverty. Instead of developing authentic values based on what actually promotes flourishing, you follow rules based on what avoids punishment. You can't explore moral complexity because you're locked into rigid commandments. You can't develop ethical wisdom through experience because your only guide is obey or suffer. The result isn't moral sophistication, it's moral infantilization, where you remain dependent on external authority rather than developing internal judgment. Nietzsche traced this pattern to what he saw as Christianity's fundamental corruption of human nature. By teaching that human desires and impulses are inherently sinful, Christianity creates a split within each person. You're taught to wage war against yourself, to see your own nature as the enemy, to suppress natural inclinations in favor of imposed rules. This isn't spiritual growth, it's psychological fragmentation, where you become alienated from your own experience. Consider how this affects the capacity for genuine spiritual experience. In traditions less dominated by fear, spirituality often involves direct experience of transcendence, connection, or meaning. But in fear-based Christianity, these experiences are mediated through doctrine and authority. You can't trust your own spiritual experiences because you might be deceived by Satan. You need priests or scripture to tell you whether what you experienced was genuine. Your direct access to spirituality is blocked by constant second-guessing and fear of being wrong. The investigation becomes even more unsettling when you examine how fear-based faith handles suffering. Instead of recognizing suffering as something to alleviate or overcome, it's reframed as potentially redemptive, as a test of faith, or as punishment for sin. This creates perverse incentives where suffering becomes meaningful in itself, rather than something to minimize. People endure abuse because leaving would show lack of faith. They accept injustice because questioning it might be questioning God's plan. They remain in misery because they've been taught that comfort isn't the goal. submission to divine will is. What Nietzsche found most troubling was how fear-based faith affects believers' capacity for joy and life affirmation. When you're constantly monitoring yourself for sin, worrying about judgment, feeling guilty about natural desires, you can't fully embrace life. Joy becomes suspicious because it might lead to pride. Pleasure becomes dangerous because it might be temptation. Success becomes threatening because it might make you forget God. The entire psychological framework is oriented toward suspicion of life rather than celebration of it. This explains why genuine mystical experiences, moments of transcendence, unity, or overwhelming love, often occur outside institutional religion or even cause people to leave it. These experiences reveal what spirituality could be if it weren't corrupted by fear. They show that the capacity for connection with something larger than yourself doesn't require threats, guilt, or terror. But institutional religion can't allow this recognition because it would undermine the entire control structure built on fear. The pattern becomes impossible to ignore once you see it clearly. Traditional Christianity systematically uses fear to maintain belief, then reframes that fear as love to obscure what's actually happening. Every core doctrine reinforces this pattern. Original sin makes you inherently guilty. Divine judgment makes you constantly anxious. Hell makes any doubt terrifying. Salvation makes you grateful for being rescued from the very punishment the system threatened you with in the first place. It's a perfect closed loop of psychological manipulation. Look at how religious authority structures operate. Priests, pastors, and religious leaders position themselves as intermediaries between you and God. They claim special knowledge of what God wants, what pleases or angers God, what leads to salvation or damnation. This gives them enormous power because they control your access to the divine and your understanding of your eternal fate. If you question them, you're not just questioning human authority, you're risking your soul. The fear of consequences makes questioning almost impossible. Now examine how this pattern plays out in religious communities. Members police each other through moral surveillance and judgment. If someone deviates from doctrine or behavior norms, they face not just social consequences, but spiritual ones. They're told they're risking their salvation. This creates a community bound together, not by genuine affection, but by shared fear and mutual enforcement of compliance. The apparent unity isn't love, it's collective anxiety management. What reveals the pattern most clearly is looking at what happens when people lose their fear. When someone stops believing in hell, does their morality collapse? Do they become monsters? Research consistently shows the answer is no. Most people who leave fear-based religion don't become immoral. They become more authentically moral because their ethics come from genuine values rather than terror of consequences. This reveals that the fear wasn't producing morality. It was just producing compliance while suppressing genuine moral development. The pattern extends to how faith handles intellectual inquiry. Questions that might undermine belief are treated as dangerous. Science that contradicts religious claims is rejected or reinterpreted. Philosophy that questions God's character is dismissed as human arrogance. This isn't how you protect truth. It's how you protect a belief system that can't survive examination. A faith based on genuine love wouldn't fear questions because love doesn't require ignorance. But a faith based on fear must prevent questioning because questions might dispel the fear. Consider how this affects people's relationship with religious texts. Instead of reading the Bible critically and recognizing its contradictions, historical context, and human authorship, believers must accept it as literally true despite obvious problems. This requires constant mental gymnastics, defending genocide as somehow just, explaining infinite punishment as somehow loving, accepting contradictions as divine mystery. The mental effort required reveals that this isn't about discovering truth. It's about maintaining belief despite evidence. Nietzsche saw this pattern replicated in how Christianity handles other religions and non-believers. Instead of seeing diverse spiritual expressions as different paths toward meaning or transcendence, other faiths are treated as false, dangerous, or demonic. Non-believers aren't just people with different views, they're sinners deserving eternal punishment. This isn't the perspective of secure love. It's the perspective of an insecure authority that can't tolerate alternatives because alternatives reveal that its claims aren't universal truths, but particular beliefs. The pattern becomes even clearer when you examine how religious teaching affects children. Kids are taught about hell before they can critically evaluate the concept. They're told they're sinful before they've developed moral reasoning. They're trained to fear God before they could possibly love God. This early conditioning creates lifelong psychological patterns that are extremely difficult to overcome because they're established before rational thought fully develops. This isn't religious education, it's psychological manipulation of the vulnerable. What emerges from examining this pattern is a profound realization. Everything about institutional Christianity is designed to create and maintain fear-based compliance while using love language to obscure what's actually happening. Believers aren't experiencing divine love. They're experiencing trauma bonding with religious authority. They're not developing genuine spirituality. They're learning to manage anxiety through ritual and belief. The entire structure functions as a control system that prevents people from recognizing it's a control system by calling itself love. The implications of this pattern extend far beyond religious belief into how people experience their entire lives. If your foundational spiritual framework is based on fear disguised as love, it distorts your capacity for all forms of love. You learn to confuse anxiety with affection, obligation with devotion, relief from threat with genuine connection. These patterns don't stay confined to your relationship with God. They bleed into every relationship and corrupt your ability to experience authentic love anywhere. Consider how this affects romantic relationships. If you learned that love means feeling grateful to someone who has power to harm you but chooses not to, you'll accept abusive dynamics as normal. If you learned that questioning someone who claims to love you is dangerous, you won't develop healthy boundaries. If you learned that your nature is fundamentally corrupt and you need someone else's grace to be acceptable, you'll tolerate mistreatment while believing you deserve it. Fear-based religious training creates templates for unhealthy relationships across your life. The implications extend to how you relate to yourself. If you've internalized that your desires are sinful, your nature is corrupt, and your judgment can't be trusted, you'll experience constant internal conflict. You'll suppress authentic feelings and thoughts, police your own consciousness, and feel guilty about being human. This isn't spiritual discipline. It's internalized abuse where you've become your own oppressor, and you'll defend this self-oppression as virtue because that's what you've been trained to do. Think about how this affects your capacity for joy and pleasure. If you've learned that enjoying life too much is dangerous, that comfort might make you forget God, that pleasure is always potentially sinful, you can't fully embrace positive experiences. You'll sabotage your own happiness, feel guilty about success, and remain suspicious of anything that feels too good. The psychological framework keeps you in a state of mild misery that you've learned to call righteousness. The implications become even more troubling when you consider how fear-based faith affects your response to suffering. Instead of recognizing suffering as something to alleviate or change, you're taught to accept it as God's will, to find meaning in it, to see it as redemptive. This makes you less likely to address real problems, whether personal abuse, social injustice, or preventable harm, because you've been conditioned to spiritualize suffering rather than reduce it. Your capacity for appropriate resistance to harm has been undermined. Nietzsche saw that this pattern affects entire societies. When a culture is dominated by fear-based religion, it produces populations that are easier to control but less capable of genuine flourishing. People who've learned to suppress their judgment in religious contexts carry that suppression into political life, accepting authority without question, following rules mechanically, fearing consequences more than they value freedom. The psychological training in religious submission translates directly into political and social compliance. What's particularly insidious is how this framework affects your relationship with your own body. Christianity teaches that the body is fallen, physical desires are corrupt, and spiritual purity requires suppressing bodily needs. This creates alienation from your own physical experience. You can't trust your body's signals, you feel shame about natural functions, and you develop a split between your spiritual self and your physical self. This fragmentation prevents the integration necessary for genuine well-being. The implications extend to how you handle uncertainty and ambiguity. Fear-based faith requires absolute certainty. You must believe without doubt, accept doctrine without question, follow rules without deviation. This leaves you completely unprepared for the actual ambiguity of life. When you encounter situations without clear rules, when you face ethical complexity, when you must make judgment calls, you freeze or retreat into rigid dogma because you never developed the capacity to navigate uncertainty with wisdom rather than fear. Consider how this affects creativity and innovation. If you've learned that deviation from established patterns is dangerous, that questioning authority is sin, that your own judgment can't be trusted. You can't create anything genuinely new. Creativity requires freedom to explore, question, fail, and try alternatives. But fear-based faith systematically destroys this freedom by making exploration dangerous, questioning sinful, and alternatives threatening. You become locked into reproducing what's already been established rather than creating anything original. The deepest implication is about the nature of human potential. Fear-based Christianity teaches that humans are fundamentally broken, that our highest calling is submission, that we need external authority to prevent us from destruction. This vastly underestimates what humans are capable of when we're not operating under constant fear. When people escape fear-based frameworks, they often discover capacities for love, creativity, wisdom, and moral reasoning they didn't know they possessed. The fear wasn't protecting them from their worst selves. It was preventing them from becoming their best selves. Now we arrive at what might be the most sophisticated psychological control system ever developed, though calling it a conspiracy misses how organically it emerged and perpetuated itself. Fear-based Christianity didn't require a coordinated plan. It emerged naturally because it served the interests of religious and political authorities while appearing to serve everyone's spiritual needs. And once established, it became self-perpetuating through generations of believers who'd internalized the fear and passed it to their children. Think about how brilliantly this system functions. Religious authorities gain enormous power by positioning themselves between individuals and God. They control access to salvation, interpret divine will, and determine who's saved or damned. This gives them influence over every aspect of believers' lives because any decision could have eternal consequences. And believers grant this power willingly because they've been taught that questioning religious authority is questioning God himself. The system is self-reinforcing at every level. Parents who were raised with fear-based faith teach it to their children, believing they're saving them from damnation. Communities built on shared fear police each other's beliefs and behaviors, maintaining conformity. Institutions gain wealth and influence by promising salvation and threatening damnation. Each part of the system supports every other part, creating a structure that's extremely resistant to change because dismantling any piece threatens the whole. What makes this particularly powerful is how it co-opts genuine human needs for meaning, connection, and transcendence. People have real spiritual longings, desires for purpose, experiences of awe, needs for community, fear-based. Religion channels these authentic needs into a framework that exploits them. You're not finding genuine spiritual fulfillment. You're getting temporary relief from artificially created fear, while your real spiritual needs remain unmet. But because this is all you've known, you mistake the relief for fulfillment. The coordination between religious and political power throughout history reveals how this system functioned. Rulers used religion to control populations by teaching that authority comes from God and resistance is sin. Religious leaders gained political protection and influence by teaching obedience to rulers as divine commandment. This mutual support meant both religious and political authorities benefited from keeping populations fearful and compliant. The alliance wasn't always explicit, but it was extraordinarily effective. Consider how this system handles dissent. Anyone who questions fear-based faith is immediately categorized as dangerous to themselves spiritually and to the community socially. They're told they're being deceived by Satan, that their doubt is sinful pride, that they're risking not just their own salvation, but potentially leading others astray. This makes dissent both terrifying for the individual and threatening to the community, creating powerful pressure toward conformity. What's particularly insidious is how the system makes believers complicit in their own control. You're taught that the fear you feel is actually reverence, that the anxiety is actually healthy spiritual awareness, that the constant self-monitoring is actually holiness. You defend the system that's harming you because you've been convinced it's protecting you. You police your own thoughts and behaviors more effectively than any external authority could because you've internalized the surveillance. The system even has built-in defenses against the specific critique we're making now. If you start recognizing that your faith is based on fear rather than love, you'll be told that's the devil trying to deceive you, that it's your pride making you question divine authority, that you're rationalizing sin. The system frames any attempt to escape it as evidence that you need it more. This makes it psychologically self-sealing. Doubt becomes proof of the need for faith rather than legitimate questioning. Nietzsche recognized that this wasn't a conspiracy in the sense of conscious coordination. It was more like an evolutionary process where the religious frameworks that best exploited human psychology through fear survived and spread, while alternatives that couldn't generate the same control died out. Christianity became dominant, partly because its particular combination of love language and fear mechanism was psychologically optimal for maintaining power while appearing benevolent. The historical spread of Christianity shows this pattern clearly. It didn't primarily spread through genuine spiritual experiences that people couldn't resist. It spread through a combination of political power, cultural pressure, and most importantly, the psychological mechanism of fear. Once people believed in hell, converting others became urgent because you were saving them from eternal torture. The fear drove evangelism, which spread the fear, creating an expansive cycle. What makes this system so difficult to escape is that it's embedded in culture beyond explicit religion. Even people who've left Christianity often retain its psychological patterns: the guilt, the fear of judgment, the suspicion of pleasure, the tendency towards self-suppression. The framework has shaped Western culture so thoroughly that its patterns feel normal rather than being recognized as specific psychological conditioning. You can reject the theology while remaining trapped in the psychology it created. The question becomes crucial. If fear-based faith functions as Nietzsche describes as psychological manipulation disguised as divine love, why hasn't this been obvious to everyone? Why do billions of people continue defending a framework that's built on terror, dressed up as spirituality? The answer reveals sophisticated mechanisms that prevent people from recognizing what's happening to them. First, the system presents fear as appropriate reverence. You're taught that fear of God is actually a good thing, a sign of proper understanding of divine majesty. The language reframes terror as respect, making the emotional manipulation invisible. People experience fear, but they've been taught to call it something else, which prevents them from recognizing the psychological reality of what they're feeling. Second, fear-based faith is usually all people have known. If you were raised in this framework from childhood, you have no reference point for what spirituality without fear would feel like. You can't miss what you've never experienced. This is like someone raised in an abusive household who doesn't recognize the abuse as abnormal because they've never known healthy family dynamics. Without alternatives, the familiar seems natural even when it's harmful. Third, the system provides real psychological benefits that obscure the costs. Fear-based religion does offer community, structure, meaning, and answers to existential questions. These genuine benefits make people reluctant to examine the foundation because they're afraid of losing what works. They don't realize that the benefits could exist without the fear, that you can have community, meaning, and purpose without psychological manipulation. The good elements obscure the toxic foundation. Fourth, recognizing that your faith is fear-based requires confronting that you've been manipulated, possibly by people who loved you and thought they were helping. Your parents taught you this framework, believing they were saving your soul. Your community reinforced it, thinking they were supporting your spiritual growth. Acknowledging it's actually harmful means recognizing that well-intentioned people damaged you. This realization is painful enough that most people unconsciously avoid it. Fifth, the system treats questioning itself as spiritually dangerous. If you start noticing that fear dominates your faith, that awareness is immediately reframed as Satan's deception or your own sinful pride. The system makes you afraid to examine whether you're afraid, which is perhaps its most sophisticated defense mechanism. Your critical thinking about the system becomes evidence that the system is working. You're being tested, tempted, or spiritually attacked. Sixth, fear-based faith was enforced by the most powerful institutions in Western history for nearly 2,000 years. The Church had authority to determine truth, punish heresy, and control access to salvation. Questioning wasn't just philosophically difficult, it was physically dangerous. People were tortured and executed for expressing doubts about church teaching. This created massive selection pressure toward either genuine belief or extremely convincing pretense, both of which perpetuated the system. Seventh, the language of love is used so consistently that it obscures the reality of fear. Every sermon, every prayer, every religious text repeatedly claims that God is love, that faith is about relationship, that salvation is a gift. This constant linguistic reinforcement makes people focus on what they're told to feel, rather than what they actually feel. The gap between the claimed experience and actual experience becomes invisible because you're trained to describe your experience in the approved language. Eighth, the system benefits from sunk cost fallacy. Once you've built your life around fear-based faith, shaped major decisions by it, raised children in it, based your identity on it, recognizing it's built on manipulation means confronting that you've potentially wasted years or decades. The psychological cost of this realization is high enough that most people prefer to continue believing rather than face what they've lost. Finally, perhaps most powerfully, the system exploits genuine uncertainty about death and meaning. Nobody knows with certainty what happens after death. Fear-based religion offers certainty. Obey and you'll be saved. Disobey and you'll be damned. The fear of infinite, negative consequences makes people accept almost any framework that promises to prevent them. Pascal's wager operates constantly in believers' minds. Even if you doubt, isn't it safer to believe just in case? Nietzsche could see through this partly because his classical education exposed him to alternative frameworks. He could read about Greek and Roman spirituality that operated without the threat of hell. He could see that the fear-based model wasn't universal or natural. It was a specific historical development. He also had the intellectual courage to follow questions wherever they led, even when the answers were uncomfortable. Most people don't have either the alternative perspective or the willingness to pursue disturbing truths. Here's the final revelation that brings everything together. If your faith is built on fear, it's not actually faith. It's just terror management with religious vocabulary. Genuine spirituality, if it exists, must be built on something other than the threat of eternal punishment. Love that requires the constant awareness of potential infinite harm isn't love. It's a hostage situation. And any relationship with the divine that makes you less capable of authentic love, joy, and flourishing isn't spiritually valuable. It's psychologically destructive. This doesn't mean spirituality itself is impossible, or that meaning can't be found. It means that authentic spirituality requires escaping the foundation of fear. What would faith look like if it were truly based on love rather than terror? It would feel safe rather than anxious. It would expand your capacity for life rather than restricting it. It would make you more capable of genuine love rather than confusing trauma bonding with affection. It would encourage questions rather than forbidding them. It would celebrate your nature rather than condemning it. Nietzsche's critique isn't that love-based spirituality is impossible. It's that, fear-based religion has corrupted our understanding of what spirituality could be. By mixing love language with fear mechanism, traditional Christianity has made genuine spiritual experience nearly impossible within its framework. The fear always undermines the love because you can't truly love what you're terrified of. The solution isn't to try harder to feel love despite the fear. It's to recognize that the fear invalidates any claim to love. So here's what this means practically. Start by honestly examining the foundation of your faith. When you think about God or practice religion, what emotion is actually dominant? Is it genuine love, affection, and connection? Or is it anxiety, guilt, fear of consequences, and relief when you feel temporarily safe? Don't answer based on what you're supposed to feel. Answer based on what you actually feel. This honest assessment is the first step toward authentic spirituality. Second, ask yourself the crucial question: if there were no hell, no punishment, no negative consequences for disbelief, would you still have faith? If the honest answer is no, or you're not sure, then your faith is built on fear, not love. This doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you someone who was trained in fear-based religion. But recognizing this truth allows you to make a conscious choice about whether that's a foundation you want to keep building on. Third, explore what spirituality